Sweet. So yeah, today's bootcamp will be on an intro to React, starting with the basics and moving on to higher level concepts. So we'll start with things like JSX, components, props, and move up into stuff around state. And just as an overview of the presentation, we'll talk about what React is, those things I mentioned, JSX, components, props. Elena will be going in talking about what state is, state management, as well as lifting state. And we will finish today with a demo with a cool little application that Elena made. So with that being said, we can go ahead and start first with what is React. So actually, sorry, give me a sec. I need to turn off dark mode real quick for my speaker notes. This is a great Chrome extension, by the way. I highly recommend it, but just not when you're giving a presentation. There we go. Yeah, so from its website, React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces created by Facebook back in 2013. Some of the three main things that it kind of advertises is that it's declarative, component-based, and easily integrated. What declarative means is that you can design simple views for each state in your application, and React can efficiently update and render just the right components when data changes. Component-based means that you can build encapsulated components that manage their own state, and then compose them later to make a complex UI. And since component logic is written in JavaScript instead of templates, you can easily pass a bunch of data through your app and keep state outside of the DOM. And easily integrated, React makes no assumptions about the tech stack that you use, so it's pretty easy to use it with whatever backend that you want. It can actually integrate with Django, if any of you guys are familiar with the Django web framework. And so yeah, and it can also render on the server using Node, so it's very powerful in that aspect. And it also powers mobile apps using React Native. So going on, we're going to start by explaining what JSX is before getting into anything else. And to understand JSX, let's first talk about what we know. So up to this point, we've just been using HTML, CSS, and a tiny bit of JavaScript to create our front ends. But when you say are going from a hello world application to a site like Reddit, which by the way, this is an actual screenshot of my Reddit, and you can see that I follow Notion, I guess. I didn't know that, but yeah. So anyway, this is a very complex UI. As you can see, there's a lot happening and there's a lot going on. You could theoretically make it maybe with some static HTML pages, but as well as some CSS, but that'd probably get really cumbersome. And there's a lot more powerful tools that are at your disposal for creating a UI like this. And that kind of gets us into talking about JSX, which JSX, by the way, is short for JavaScript XML. And so yeah, so I guess for this example's sake, say we wanted to build a Reddit-like website. Now Reddit has, it's a very dynamic website, and there's data that's always changing. There's a lot of moving parts. You can, need to change like counts, comments, do things like switch from light mode to dark mode. And you can do all these things with our old friend, the DOM, and specifically using DOM manipulation. And so for this example, say we wanted to add a post, and you can probably model this post with this kind of HTML that you can see on the right side here, with a section tag, an H1 tag, and maybe 2 paragraph tags. We've seen DOM manipulation before when we use element.innerText. That kind of accesses the inner text of an HTML tag. You can either set it or get it. But yeah, what if we literally want to add a chunk of HTML to our page? Well, then we can actually do this, and we can actually add HTML using functions that the DOM provides us. And so you can see on the right here that we're actually creating all of this HTML using JavaScript. And so you just kind of do some document.createElement calls to create your elements, set the inner text by accessing the inner text property of each of these variables, appending it to the section tag, and then appending that section tag to our DOM as a child tag. And so this, as you can kind of see, requires a lot of writing just for a single post. So wouldn't it be better if we could actually just write HTML? Because this is writing HTML using JavaScript. But what if we could actually write HTML inside of our JavaScript? Well, we actually can with JSX. And as you can see in these images on the right, this is JSX. This is you declare a const post, and you can just throw HTML in it just like that. And you can also do things like adding variables inside using the curly brace syntax. And the JSX will actually see what these variables are and include it. Include the "you won't believe this" and the emojis when the page ultimately gets rendered. Yeah, so that's kind of what JSX does. It allows us to write HTML within a JavaScript file. And you can see as we talk more about React, how that kind of helps us. And so, and just this is a slide on just the JSX syntax. You can use curly braces for JavaScript variables and functions, actually. So not only can you pass like a variable to an HTML tag, but you can also, using this curly brace syntax, pass functions, as you can see like right here in this one. This is if you had a format name function just like right above this, right above this code. And these two screenshots are to illustrate this other thing, which says you always need a container around your HTML if you're using multiple HTML elements. So in this one, you can see this is a bad example of it. This is a good example because this is actually correct. And yeah, you just kind of need a wrapper around whatever HTML tags that you choose to use. And also, you want to use quotes or the curly braces. You don't want to ever use both. Quotes let you explicitly tell like JavaScript that I just want this, like I just want to write this. Whereas curly braces, it'll actually, JavaScript will interpret it later on what the value of that variable is. So moving on. Yeah, so just a quick aside, like how this is kind of accomplished and what is kind of happening at the lower level is this thing called Babel. And what Babel does, it's essentially a JavaScript compiler that compiles JavaScript down to just React.createElement API calls using the createElement like API. And so what this actually just gets turned into once Babel kind of sees it is a createElement call with h1 is the first parameter, class name and greeting argument. So class name and greeting is the second argument, and hello world is the third argument. And the result of React.createElement will actually become this. So what React.createElement returns is an object of this structure with a type of h1 and props of these two, class name greeting and children hello world. And yeah, so how does this all get accomplished? Is Babel, which we kind of talked about before. And Babel transcribes JSX and React code to regular JS. There's a lot that happens under the hood that we're not going to talk about for the purpose of today's React lecture. But if you're interested, there's tons of documentation for Babel online. And yeah, so that is probably all I wanted to say about JSX. And so moving on to components. Before we get into components, I would like to talk about rendering, because that word is kind of thrown around a lot in React, but also just I think JavaScript in general, depending on the JS framework that you use. Rendering is a fundamental aspect of the React framework. It's basically what allows us to kind of throw in JSX variables onto a web page. And it also means we can change or update our web page when we have some new JSX to display. And so what is it that we need to render actually? It's our React elements. And here's just a comparison of browser DOM elements versus React elements. Browser DOM elements are expensive to create as it involves manipulation of the actual DOM itself to make changes. While React elements, on the other hand, are just JavaScript objects, so they're pretty cheap to create. And so the React DOM will handle updating the DOM to match React elements, and we'll talk more about how it accomplishes this later. But just to kind of tell you what the React DOM is, it's a virtual DOM, which is an abstraction of the HTML DOM. And it's lightweight and detached from the browser-specific details. Since the DOM itself was already an abstraction, the virtual DOM is actually like an abstraction of that abstraction, which is pretty cool. And it allows React to do its computations within this within this abstract world to skip the real DOM operations, which are kind of slow and browser specific. And thanks, Ben. It's document object model. And yeah, so this code on the side is just kind of showing what React DOM.render call looks like. You pass in an element. So that's just an example of what an element can look like. Just a H1 tag. That's just kind of, this is JSX right here. So you pass it some JSX as well as the root DOM node, which I don't know if I've talked about. Oh yeah, I'm about to talk. So yeah, so React all kind of starts at something called the root DOM node. And so if you've made a React app before, you might have seen that there is a div with an ID of root that I think occurs typically in the index.html file. Yeah, I think. I could be wrong about that. But it is in the HTML that is kind of served immediately. And basically all your React, like everything that's inside of that root is what React will render. And so this is where all the React code starts. And essentially everything in there is kind of managed by the React DOM. And I think for our purposes and probably for your purposes, your React apps will just have one root DOM node. So you won't have to worry about managing multiple root DOM nodes. And to render a React element into a root DOM node, this is some example code of what that looks like, very similar to the image that we just saw on the previous slide. It's a call with React DOM.render. We pass it a JSX element, and we also pass it the root DOM node. Yeah. And yeah, and then this is a slide that kind of talks about how React is efficient and it only updates what's necessary. And so I kind of mentioned this briefly before, but the React DOM, like the reason why we have a React DOM in the first place, we don't just have the DOM itself, is because we want to be computationally efficient and not be doing low-level DOM operations when we can just actually be doing something in memory. And in the image on the side, you can kind of see what React is actually doing, but it'll actually compare element and children with previously rendered things. And so it'll only apply changes that are necessary. So it won't re-render everything. It only re-renders the things that kind of need to be changed and re-rendered. So this is kind of a hassle if you need to re-render every time. And React has a tool that's specifically for re-rendering that we'll talk about soon that is called state. And Elena will be talking about that pretty soon. But yeah, so that is talking about the React DOM a little bit more. Does anyone have any questions so far? And if you do, you can also just send it in the chat. But yeah. But moving on, so finally, we'll talk about components. So components are very similar. they're a lot like these JSX variables that we've been writing. However, they offer a lot more power by adding reusability, input variables, state management, just to name a few things. And components are found in nearly every front-end framework you'll come across. They're not unique to React. The best way to think about it is that each component is a reusable slice of a web page, each having its own structure, which is its HTML, and logic in order to function, which is its JavaScript. And so basically a component is a mini code pen, and a web page is a ton of code pens working together. And CodePen, that's just referencing this tool that Ethan's kind of used in the past. And I included, this is my GitHub home screen, but this is actually an example of a lot of components working together. Up here, you kind of have a nav bar component. You have a feed component right here. You have like this repository stuff happening on the side. You have your own user profile dropdown. But yeah, these are probably, I didn't look into the GitHub website code, but I would imagine this is all like component based, kind of separation of concerns when it comes to this UI. And so, yeah, and that's my GitHub, by the way. Shameless plug, go follow me, and I'll probably follow you back because you're in Hack for Impact. But yeah, anyway, so this is the actual definition from the React website. Components let you split the UI into independent reusable pieces and think about each piece in isolation. And this is very powerful because it allows us to abstract our entire UI into different pieces. Also, it allows us to only worry about pieces in isolation. So, and that's very helpful when you're trying to figure out a bug with your front end code. Another thing to note is that components are like JavaScript functions in that they accept input in the form of props, and props are short for properties. And they also return an output of React elements, which describe what should appear on the screen. On the right, you can see two different types of components, functional component up here, as well as a class-based component down here. The function is a valid React component because it accepts, as you can see, a single props argument, and it returns a React element in the form of JSX. And you can also use ES6 classes to define a component. Down here, you can see that it extends React.component so that it actually is a class-based component, and it is doing something very similar in that it is returning some JSX output. And yeah. Classes have some additional features that we'll probably discuss later. And yeah, so this is a very low resolution image, but please ignore that. But anyway, this is what a component looks like. So as you can probably see, this is very similar to an HTML tag like a H1 or a UL. But it is, in fact, actually a user-defined React component. And so by writing multiple components like this, you can piece them all together and create a complete UI. So that's some pretty exciting stuff. Typically, just as a best practice, you capitalize your component names. Yeah, and this right here, this name equals Eric, that's an example of passing some props into the component itself. And when Elena is showing her demo code, she'll show some examples of actual, like, the code behind these components. Okay, so yeah, moving on into props. Like I mentioned before, props are the input that are passed down to a child component from a parent component. And so in a React application, you typically start in a file called App.js. And that is where you include all of the other components. And you can pass props down just like this same piece of code. You can pass down a name equals Eric. These are just some examples of passing props down. You can do it with the explicit quotes where you say like Ethan Zimbelman and his characteristic is wholesome. You could also do something where you use the curly brace notation and you can actually just access JavaScript objects characteristic property. So you can pass down props that way as well. And yeah, and this is just an example of if you want to access those props from the child component, because in this previous slide, we were in the parent component and we were actually just passing the props downward. When you're actually in the child component, to access what is kind of passed down to you, you can just do a .name or .characteristic to find those values. And I think that's all I wanted to say about components and props. Does anyone have any questions before we move on to the state portion of the presentation? Okay, cool. If you do have any questions, you can also DM me too, just in the Zoom chat as well. But yeah, Elena, you can probably go ahead and get started.
All right, and thank you everybody for, we know this is a much longer one. We wanted to give you a good understanding of React before you go to the UI UC presentation on Thursday. So this is a little bit more content than usual, but we just have state and then the demo left. So first talking about state, Eric, next slide, I don't have control. Okay, so first talking about what is state. So each React component has a built-in state object, and this state object, we use it to store values related to the component, its data, and what we want to display or render. And it is different than any normal object or variable because every time we change a component state, the component re-renders, and that is the magic of using React. It's really useful to respond to user input, or if you get updated data from an API and you want to re-render a component to reflect that updated data, you can simply change the state and it will re-render for you, which is really great. Excellent. Okay, so there are two different ways that we can modify state, and it kind of goes back to what Eric was saying about the two different ways to talk about or to define components. So if you define it using a class, this is one way that you can modify state and define state. So first, looking on the left-hand side, realize you can't see my cursor, but looking on the left-hand side, we are going to, this is a constructor for a class, which may look similar if you've done like object-oriented programming, but we have this dot state equals some object. The state object will already be created even if you don't do this, but it just won't have any attributes. So when we put this in the constructor, we are adding an attribute to the state named open, and we are setting the default value to false. You can have any number of attributes listed in this object. And you can also add objects later, even if you don't define a default value initially. Looking on the right-hand side, this is an example of changing the state. So we can use the method this.setState and include the attribute name and then the value that we want to give it. In this case, we are just flipping it from either false to true or true to false, depending on which one. You can, so say on the left example, you had multiple attributes listed. If you do this.setState and just one attribute, it'll simply update that one attribute. It won't override the whole object, which is nice. So that is if you're using a class defined component. Then next slide. So we can also use the React.useState method. And this one looks a little bit bizarre, but it's actually really cool and very powerful. So I think it's best to just look at the syntax first. So we have a variable and a set variable in this weird array, and we say React.useState initial value. This first variable, like it literally says variable. So this is the name of the state attribute. So in the last example, that was called open. This is also that name of whatever attribute. The next value in that array is the name of a function that we use to change the variable or change the attribute in this state. So if I called set variable true, that would change the value of variable to true. And then this uses state initial value. This initial value is what variable will be set to initially, the same way that we defined it in the constructor previously. we use this React.useState with components that you define as functional components. So it's a different notation, but you're still, the state object is still the same thing. It's just a different notation. And this was a little bit confusing, so let's look at an example. I think is next. Let's see. Never mind. Okay, we'll come back to that. So first I want to
Wait, did
talk,
you want to share your screen?
not yet. I'll do that at the end.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Um, so just a brief note on parent-child relationships in React, and I think Eric touched on this very briefly. So React can have nested components the same way you can have nested tags in HTML. And we can pass information from parent to child using props, which we talked about, but you can't directly pass information from child to parent, nor can we pass information from components between components on the same level. So you can't pass a prop from a child to a parent. In this example down here is simply just passing props name and description into this item component. And so now if we go to the next slide, there is one kind of way to get around this, and that is with state. So a child component can change the state of a parent component, and that's what we call lifting state. So it's not the same thing as props. You cannot pass props from child to parent, but a child can change the state of the parent component. And so if you recall, props, we can pass both variables and functions as props. And when we use React.useState, we already defined a function that changes that state. And so if you go back 2 slides, Eric, sorry. So in this example, we have variable and set variable. The set variable, that is a function that will always change that component's state. So what we can do is we can pass the set variable function to a child component, and the child can use that function to change the state of its parent. So now go 3 slides forward. Okay, so here's an example of this. So looking at the top component profile list, it has a state object called new, or state attribute new follow, and a method that changes that state set new follow, because we're using this React.useState notation. Then in profile list, we have a child component where it says profile, and we say its prop is set new follow equals this value of the function that changes the new follow variable in the parent state. So now if you look down at the profile.js component at the bottom, we have a button on click. And when this event happens, you can say props.setNewFollow because we've passed that function down as a property. You can call this function, and that function will change the value of the parent state. So this is the only way that you can really pass information from child to parent. You cannot do that using props, but you can have a child set the state of the parent. Does anybody have any questions about that? I know it's a little weird notation wise. Okay. Then let's go to the next slide, and I think, okay, so now, yeah, Eric, if you want to stop sharing your screen, I can share mine. Okay, so now we're going to look at a demo, and I'm just going to share my whole desktop, so I apologize in advance. Can everybody see my desktop? Yes? Cool. So we're going to look at a few things, starting with this really fun thing that React gives us called create React app. So the command looks exactly like this. So we can use npx create React app. And basically what this command does is give you a little bit of scaffolding that you can use to start a React application. And it's very helpful. I would recommend doing this if you are creating a React application. So I'm just going to open this code to show you the starter code that you get using create React app. So the first thing that you should notice is we have a node modules folder. We also have a package.json. That should look familiar because in the node bootcamp session, this is what you use. So you can still use npm packages with React, which is really nice. And so then we have this public folder and we have this source folder. The main things that we should note about this is the index.html. It gives you a lot of random stuff that you don't really need. But this is the main point is there is one HTML file and that's it. And so the main part to note is, as Eric mentioned previously, we have this div with an ID root. And when we go to our index.js file, we only have one React dom.render call, and we put all of our React code and we stick it into this div with the ID of root. And so what Create React App does is kind of give you the scaffolding for just having one index.html file connected to your JavaScript that contains a React component. And so our component in this case is app, which we have defined right here. And so if we run this, I can just show you what it looks like. It's not that exciting, but again, it is very helpful to start a React project. So maybe. So this is all it is. This is what Create React App does, but it gives you a React project that you can run, which is very nice. Okay, moving on. So the next thing that I want to do, and I'm so sorry, designers, because this is a horrendous looking application, but what I did is I created a very basic static website. And even with this very basic website, you can see a lot of the major components, or not components, that's poor choice of words, a lot of the major pieces of React, even for such a simple example. So say somebody doesn't like paper or Google Docs or email or anything, and they want to create a whole new website for their Christmas list. I don't know why you would do that, but I did. And so I think it is this one. Okay, so here's my Christmas wish list. And again, designers, this is why you're here. So this is a very, very basic app. It has no back end whatsoever. It's just a React app. I did Create React App and added some components. So let's try to identify some of the components that we can see here. One is the snow. The snow, that animation is actually simply a React component. And then we have these items of my wish list that are also components. I have 5 item components here, and then we have one giant component that the item is in that includes this heading and our lovely countdown to Christmas, 51 days apparently. So looking at this, let's go look at the code. And I think it's this one. I'm so sorry, I have so many windows. Okay, so looking at the code for this, the first thing that we see is it looks really similar to Create React App, again, because it's a very simple application. But the only HTML that I have in the entire thing is this. And I, again, have our one div with the ID of root. This connects to our index.js file. And what we do is we stick all of this React, all these React components into this one div. And so you can see I have 2 components really that I'm putting in here, Snowfall and app. Snowfall is something that I just downloaded. I spent a very long time searching for which Snowfall I wanted to use. However, if you will recall Cowsay or Cowspeak or whichever one that was, we can use the exact same thing, install things with npm. Because React uses components, it's really easy to install component libraries and just use components that other people have made. So I did npm install React Snowfall, imported this component, and now I can treat it as any other component, which is really, really nice. Some other things that you might use are React Bootstrap or styled components. Those make it a lot easier to create nicely styled components and not just have to kind of start from scratch with CSS. So not going to focus on that a ton, but is something to note. So we have our Snowfall component and we have our app component. So let's look at the app. So this is a component that I defined, and it is defined as a class. And so we have our render method that returns some JSX uh, to uh, to its parent component, which then renders that. So looking at this, we have some data, and for now, I just have it like statically defined. I just typed it all out. Probably you will be calling that from an API, getting some user input or what have you, but it works pretty much the same way. So I have this data, and what I want to do is first I have my title, I have my Christmas countdown, which again is literally just another component that I found on the internet, super helpful. If you need like a search bar, if you need snow falling, like anything that you can think of, I guarantee you there's a component already built, so don't waste your time rebuilding things if you don't need to. But the main thing that I am showing on this website is my Christmas wish list. And so for every item, I want to display a item component. And so this is what this part of the code is doing. So data.map, one of the cool things is our functions can just return JSX. And so I can literally just call any function in these curly braces, and whatever it returns will just get put into these as child components in this JSX element. So with data.map, I loop through every element in data, and for each one, I create an item component, which I have defined here, and we will look at that in a minute. If you remember from the slides, this is an example of passing props. So we have our data for name and description, and for our item component, we are passing that data as props. So we are giving it a name and a description. So we are passing information from the parent to the child component. Okay, so now let's look at the item component. So this again is defined as a class. And right now, I'm going to use this as an example of looking at React state as well. So I still have my render function with my return. And let's just first look at how we are using our props. So I can use the props when in my return function simply by saying this.props.name gets the name that was passed from that data object. And so that is how all that text is being returned right here. Now let's say for some strange reason, I need to have a description for every item on my Christmas wish list because I want to be very specific. But I don't want to display it. Normally I want to click this arrow and a little drop down should, oh, you can't see my hand. A little drop down should pop down with the description. We can use React state to do this because every time an action happens, every time we click that button, we want to render some code differently or render some different code. But I first want to look at why we can't do this with a normal variable. So this is what is implemented now. So let's start with this code down here. So we have this FA angle down. This is this little icon right here. Again, you can import icons as components as well. So those are really easy to get, which is nice. So when I click this, I'm going to call this function. And I have this expand description function. And what this does is it will change our variable. So right now, open is a normal variable. It's not a state attribute, it's just a simple normal variable. And every time I click on one of those arrows, I should change open to the opposite value of what it is. So if it's false, then I'll change it to true. And now we have this other function here that has get description, and it says if open is true, then I want to return this JSX. And that is down here because again, you can simply call a function. If it returns JSX, that will just be put as a child component in whatever container it is in currently. And if you return null, it's totally fine. It just won't render anything. So if open is true, then we want to display this description. So let's look at what is happening right now. And I can do that with inspect, maybe. Yeah, okay. So let's look at the console, and I have a print statement right here, saying what the value of open is. So every time I click on this arrow, I am printing the value of open. So that's good. It's changing, but why are we not seeing any result on here? And the answer is this function, this get description function, will never be called even if open, that value is changing. And the reason is this is a normal function. We are not telling React to re-render the component in any way. And so that is why we need to use state, because anytime state changes, then React will re-render. So let's look at that. And for the sake of time, we're just going to go up here. And all this code is nearly identical. The only thing that I have changed, we still have our expand description and our get description functions here. But instead of using a normal value for open, I have it as a state variable. So I have the default value as false. And then I use set state to change that value every time we click the icon. And then theoretically, because we are changing the state, it should re-render every time. And this is the part that re-renders. And because this get description function is in that JSX, it will call this function and we will get an updated description. So let's look at how that actually looks. Okay, so now because we are using state, theoretically, when we click this, now I have my little description for why I want an Australian Shepherd. I don't know, again, why anybody would need this, but it is a good example of using state. And so we can switch all of them like that and it will re-render automatically. We don't need to worry about that. So that is a very, very quick overview of React. We don't expect you guys to know how to use this fully, but this does highlight some of the most basic concepts of components, props, and state. Does anybody have any questions about that? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Cool.
Does each component keep track of its own kind of state variables?
Yes, so each component has its own state, and even if you have, so we had multiple items listed, each one has its own state object. They don't share one or anything of that sort. Oh, yeah, okay, I'm looking at the comments now. Yes, I know I have a lot of tabs, but yeah, I know where everything is though, so it's okay. All right, if there are no questions, I think that is the end of today's bootcamp session. Please feel free to stay if you have other questions beyond what we, or with bootcamp in general, or with what we've gone over today.
Yeah, and just as a quick reminder, this Thursday, you won't be coming to our Zoom link. You'll actually be going to a different Zoom link that will, I think, yeah, we'll post in the Slack. But it's a workshop that's actually being hosted by UIUC at 6 p.m. Pacific time. So not Cal Poly time, 6 p.m. on the dot. So, yeah.
And thank you all for coming. I know this is a stressful day, so thank you for being here. And take care of yourself, because I know week 8 and election is stressful. But with that, I think you all are free to go unless you have any questions.